When the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, they were immediately met by the indigenous people. And from the beginning, it was a major power struggle, for it started with them being fully vulnerable. The new settlers were greedy and wanted something that the indigenous people didn't. They wanted the opportunities and prosperity that they were promised when they immigrated from Europe. They knew there was only one way to get that from the position they were in: go over, under, around, or the most likely option, through the indigenous people. The Europeans had a very different culture when it came to land ownership. They saw land as something to be owned, while the American Indians' culture saw it as something to be shared. They would do anything in its power to conquer and control the land. The American Indians' approach was to share the land, but the Europeans wanted it all. They forced their culture on them, and then forced out all the indigenous, and forced them to migrate to harsh, faraway reservations. This resulted in many deaths. The first reservation was made in 1851. The Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota was created 38 years later, almost immediately met with outcries of the furious citizens that were moved there. The tragedy of the reservations, specifically that those happened at Pine Ridge, still haunts America's past and present. To this day, the Pine Ridge Reservation is one of the biggest and most well-known Native American reservations. It is well known for multiple reasons. Some of the reasons is that it is one of the poorest communities in America, and another is the long list of historical conflict between the Native Americans and of the reservation and the government. The first conflict was on December 29th, 1890. American soldiers were trying to disarm the Oglala Lakota when a gun went off, which triggered the 7th Cavalry to engage in heavy fire on the Oglala Lakota. And they didn't have enough time to react.
In February
The 7th Cavalry
1973,
lost 25
around
men,
200
and the
Oglala Lakota,
lost 90
backed by
men,
the American
and 200
Indian
women and
movement,
children.
seized control of the town of
Nearby
Wounded
civilians
Knee
were also
in the
killed,
Pine Ridge
which
Reservation,
left a
South
dark
Dakota,
shadow of the
taking
government
11
looking over the
residents
Pine Ridge
hostage.
Reservation until
One
February
reason why this
of
occupation happened was a
1973.
result of the Oglala Sioux Civil Rights Organization not being able to remove and impeach Pine Ridge Tribal President Richard Wilson. Wilson was accused of abuse of political opponents and corruption by the Oglala, Lakota, and AIM. Wilson was elected in 1972 and served through 1976. Some of the complaints against him was that he favored friends and family and gave them jobs instead of other members of the tribe, and using his private militia to attack and prevent his political opponents from speaking out. Another reason is that it was the perfect place for the American Indian movement, AIM, to demand that the U.S. follow through on their old treaties, giving the natives land. The Oglala Lakota were desperate for a solution, so in a last-ditch effort, they turned to AIM for a solution. AIM was created in 1968 by many Native leaders, including Dennis Banks and Russell Means. It was formed as a militant, political, and civil rights group. Before Wounded Knee, AIM took over Alcatraz in 1969, claiming it was rightfully their land based on a treaty with the United States. AIM also briefly occupied the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, in 1972 to protest programs that controlled Native reservation development. After some planning by AIM and the Oglala Lakota earlier in 1973, they launched their occupation of Wounded Knee during the night of February 27, 1973. They arrived in Wounded Knee during the night, sneaking in a caravan of trucks and cars. They then took 11 Wounded Knee residents hostage and demanded the U.S. to follow through on treaties signed in the 19th century. After a few hours of the coup, police surrounded the area, keeping AIM and the protesters in and keeping people who wanted to join out. This moment marked the start of the 71-day siege and conflict. The conflict that followed would be the largest civil disorder in U.S. history. Daily gunfire was traded between AIM protesters and the U.S. forces, being National Guard and FBI. To put an end to the siege, the United States cut off water and electricity to Wounded Knee and prevented food and ammo from being received by the armed protesters. A civil rights activist and pilot from Boston, Bill Zimmerman, who was sympathetic to the protesters, agreed to make a 2,000-pound food drop on day 50 of the 71-day siege. When AIM and Lakota protesters fled the buildings that they were camping out in, U.S. agents fired upon the protesters, and the first casualty of the 71-day siege was killed, a Cherokee protester named Buddy Lamont. He was hit by a bullet that flew through a nearby church. One member of AIM told PBS, "They were shooting machine gun fire at us, tracers coming at us at the night time, just like a war zone. We had some Vietnam vets with us, and they said, 'Man, this is just like Vietnam.' The U.S. was so desperate to end the conflict before more casualties were claimed, and the Oglala were devastated by the loss of Buddy Lamont. AIM wanted to continue the fight, but the Oglala had enough. Open negotiations began between the protesters and the U.S. Finally, on May 8th, 70 days after the siege began, the combined AIM and Lakota forces surrendered. Some fled the town to avoid getting arrested. The rest of AIM and the Oglala were arrested, including the 2 AIM leaders."
The incident was clearly a strategic move trying to get AIM out of the virtual checkmate that the government had them in. They knew that they would get less publicity than usual if they simply protested. The natives knew they needed to do something newsworthy, like holding innocent people hostage, to get publicity. What they didn't realize is that by being violent, the government would outsmart them and focus on the violence instead of the message that they tried to send. This is why the plan went horribly wrong. During the siege, 2 AIM agents ended up dying, and there was a shootout in which Leonard Peltier, someone on AIM's side, killed 2 FBI agents. The government took advantage of the situation to make an excuse to not improve the living conditions of the reservation. Even though only 2 FBI agents were killed, both by Peltier, 2 natives were killed and 14 more were injured during the deadly shootout, making no side less at fault than the other. But the FBI, knowing that they have power over the reservation, being the top-secret government that they are, they overruled any decisions that the Pine Ridge Board could make and didn't help with the native situation at all, resulting in an even more anger and uproar from the residents' side of things. Adding on to this was the rate of crime and murder after the event. Not only were people inspired by Peltier standing up to the bigger and stronger government, they were also inspired to kill, making him seem like a bad role model to the public. While there's more to the story than just that, the government uses the Wounded Knee Massacre like a mom uses a "because I told you so." And to this day, the Pine Ridge Reservation is the second poorest reservation in the U.S. And to this day, people in the Pine Ridge aren't allowed simple basic things a U.S. citizen is allowed, such as there's no alcohol on the reservation, which has recently been bringing an uproar from the Pine Ridge Board over the past 15 years. The situation is very similar to the embargo currently held on Cuba. For comparison, in both of these situations, the U.S. is oppressing the mostly innocent citizens and creating an environment that is deeply in poverty. The U.S. needs to act on this issue because if they fix the biggest problem at the biggest reservation, that will open doors to solving problems at every reservation nationwide. The Native Americans deserve to be treated like normal U.S. citizens, if not better off, because of the centuries-long hardship that they've dealt with ever since the immigrants came around. This will be much better for not only the well-being of all natives, but for the U.S. economy, by adding to the workforce.